Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am speaking with Marissa Harrison. Marissa is the Associate Professor of Psychology in the School of Behavioral Sciences and Education at Penn State Harrisburg. She has a bachelor's in psychology and a PhD in biopsychology with a specialization in evolutionary psychology. She is a research psychologist who investigates serial murder and has interest in serial murder from an evolutionary and other psychological perspectives. She's been widely published in the field, and she is the author of the latest book, Just as Deadly: The Psychology of Female Serial Killers. That's the book we talk about in this conversation. We start out by talking about why the media sensationalizes serial killers. We talk about all of the, podcasts and, different television shows and true crime and all this, and why this is not necessarily a positive thing. We mention morbid curiosity. We define serial killers. How are they usually defined? She gives the profile of a female serial killer and kind of what that looks like from what we usually understand with male serial killers. We talk about some of the motives for women killing. We define psychopathy and sociopathy, and we talk about the PCL-R. We talk about mental illness in serial killers. We talk about whether psychopathy should be its own disorder or maybe a neurological disorder or something else. We talk about the need for improved mental health services. Some of her major work that she's done looking at certain data points for female serial killers. We talk about infanticide, the neurobiology of serial killers, the future of research on serial killers, and many more topics. I was very, very interested to talk to her. Her book was fabulous. I hadn't read anything like it, and it's very good. It's very readable. I've read some of her papers as well. She's a great researcher, wonderful, wonderful person, and really trying to do honest work, which is what we need in the field. We need people doing good science, and that's definitely what she's doing. So, as always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergentdialogues.substack.com. You can subscribe for free over there and listen to this one and all the other ones that are up there and the ones that come in the future. And now I bring you Marissa Harrison. I'm here with Marissa Harrison. Marissa, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to talking to you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Of course, yeah. You've written a really interesting and fascinating book, which I really enjoyed. I enjoyed it a lot, actually, which is called Just as Deadly: The Psychology of Female Serial Killers, which may be a surprise for some or haven't heard too much about this, so we'll get all into it. So before we do, tell folks a little bit about yourself, your background, what you do, what you currently research and write on.
Sure, absolutely. So I am Associate Professor of Psychology at Penn State Harrisburg. By training, I am a biopsychologist with a specialization in evolutionary psychology, with some training in social psych and behavioral neuroendocrinology. And I, from an evolutionary perspective, study just about anything because it is a framework. So I've studied everything from love to murder. And for the past maybe 9 years or so, I've gone down the path of studying murder. Very interesting, dark path that needs more and more research to elucidate, but that's what I've been doing lately.
Yeah, that's wonderful. You got quite the mix there. I think one of the things that people slowly start to realize, at least hopefully, is that psychology is a big world. It's a big world, and so there's all these sub branches that are. I think we play along a little bit better than we used to, but can be pretty different. And so you have the social psych folks and evo psych folks, and you got forensic psych folks and neuropsych folks, and they all kind of do their own thing. And so it's always nice when people have some kind of overlap or they're crossing different disciplines in that way to try and find a cohesive kind of pattern through things. So obviously, if you're doing research on murder or things that are a little bit darker of the human nature, it's good to have a nice, balanced plate of different things to pull from. So it's wonderful.
I absolutely agree with you. And I teach in an undergraduate psych program, and I also teach in a graduate psychology program. I taught biopsychology in the graduate program for a very long time. And usually the students came in very hesitant. We don't want to learn biopsych. And I said, listen, and they very well know we understand something the best we could when we look at it from multiple angles, right? We try to look at the biopsychosocial point of view. And if you think one of those angles is not important, you're wrong and you're doing a disservice to science.
Yeah, yeah, and I totally agree. That was kind of the model we used as well when I was being trained, was biopsychosocial model, and trying to look at different types. And of course, there's different models that people can use, but I think trying to have a little bit more balance is important. Okay, so for this book, I guess it's about. mm, I would say that psychopathology. You do emphasize female serial killers for sure, and you've done a few big studies in here that you mentioned. But I do see it as kind of a little bit more on certain aspects, I guess, of psychopathology. In a way, it's not entirely just about that. I guess the big question I have for you is, if you spent a lot of time looking at different things, why did you want to, write this book in particular, and get this kind of information and research you've done out there?
Thank you for asking. It's interesting you should say that. I found a lot of information out there on serial murders in general to be either sensationalized or
Mhm.
focusing solely on male perpetrators. And in my research, in my team's research, we've conducted a few studies on female serial murderers, and we found so many differences between them and between male perpetrators. We wanted to get the word out there. And why I wanted to write a book was because honestly, a lot of the other books out there on serial murder in general either don't have any references in them or
Mhm.
reference each other or reference the same old, same old. And I wanted a scientific book out there with references, with documentation, with, certainly my scientific opinions, but fact formed opinions out there. And you'll find in the book Just as Deadly, there are about 1,200 references.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
I didn't want to have the same old type of book out there.
Mhm.
So I felt just clarification of issues and presenting my research journey, not necessarily about Marissa's research journey, but the research my team and I have done to try to elucidate um, the means, motives, and makings of female serial murderers.
Mhm. Yeah, well, you do it, very, very well, so it's
Thank
great.
you.
I Before we get into all the good stuff, I do wanna ask about, just kinda get it out of the way, I guess, this idea that people have almost this obsessive, fascination with, true crime and serial killers, and obviously there's a million shows about it, and, documentaries and podcasts and all these things like that, and so why why do you think that is? And, I mean, I have my own personal opinions about it. I think a lot of these do sort of a disservice. I don't think sensationalizing things is very helpful in the grand scheme of things. And then we can talk about morbid curiosity. I've had Colton Scrivener on. He's a great guy, and we've talked about this stuff as well. And you mentioned in your book, morbid curiosity as well. So I guess, why this obsession? Why do people sensationalize this stuff? Why we shouldn't do that? And, any aspects of morbid curiosity you want to touch on here?
Sure. So, yeah, I'm definitely familiar with Colton's work. Erica Frederick and I did a research project and published a paper on morbid curiosity as it relates to protective vigilance, which relates to interest in serial murder. So, let me explain that a little. So, morbid curiosity, right? We pay attention to the things that can harm us. And we're not arguing that it's conscious. In other words, you're not saying, okay, let me look at that car accident because it's going to hurt me. It's not
Mhm.
really what we do. We argue it's an evolved drive. So over time, humans who paid attention to the things that could harm us probably left more descendants than humans who didn't pay attention to those things. And so, why is that the case? Well, others have argued that protective vigilance would be a great term for that, right? So, again, I attend to the things, I am vigilant about the things that can harm me, I pay attention to them. And we did find in our research that was related to interest in serial murder. I don't think it's a huge stretch, but we did
Mhm.
document it with a scientific study. Um, I agree with you. Now, I am pleased that people are interested in science. Of course, I think knowing is preferable to not knowing in any realm. But I totally agree with you in terms of the sensationalism of murder and particularly serial murder. I do think it goes to an extreme. I don't want to re-victimize victims or their families
Mhm,
and their friends. You'll never catch me talking about gore or stuff like that. It gives me, honestly, it gives me a sick feeling in my stomach to think that anything would hurt the victims further than they're already hurt.
mhm,
And so, as a research psychologist, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to write a book. I hope people like the book. I hope they find it engaging, but it's not going to be one of those
mhm,
dark and stormy night type things.
mhm,
That's
mhm,
just not who I am or what I'm going to do.
mhm. Yeah, I agree. I think that there's really what we're discussing is there's a type of ethic, I think, that has to be surrounding I think a lot of things, but really around sensitive material. I mean, these are things that, people's lives have been forever changed and turned upside down from some pretty tough stuff. People that survive potential attempts at being, kidnapped or murdered, or those that have had family members that have. And so, I think of course, there is obviously some curiosity about some of these things, human nature, or, potential, harm. I think that's all, kind of generally that's fine to be interested of, nominally. But I think there is we do have to have these kind of ethical contours about how we talk about this stuff, how much we talk about this stuff, the way in which we talk about this stuff. So, obviously, I think that's why your book is very good because it helps contribute to that conversation of good science, but also saying here's a way in which to talk about this that's respectful, that's good science communication and good research and good data. So I think that's obviously I think should be very central. So
Thank you for that, Xavier. I have to stress. I mean, if somebody's interested in watching, a drama or a documentary on TV, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that.
sure, yeah,
So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being interested in a documentary or specials on cable networks. In fact, I really, really respect a lot of the work done by, for example, A&E and Oxygen Channel puts out some really good stuff, as well as the networks. NBC Peacock does some great stuff. Believe me, I do know these things are true,
sure.
and they're not paying me. But what I get, they're not. What you don't get paid for this kind of thing, as you know. What I get concerned is like if somebody's going to try to pay a serial killer for her underpants, which does happen. I
Mhm.
That's a little extreme. Or having watercolors of Ted Bundy committing crimes or wanting the knife that Richard Ramirez used. Or phone cords used in crimes. I I don't know. As you know, I'm a scientist, but now going back to being a human being, I don't know why you would want that stuff. I don't. I That alarms me a little bit. And generally speaking, I've gotten people very respectfully interested in wanting to learn about my research and whatnot. But I do get some strange inquiries and
I'm sure
contacts,
you
and
do. I'm
I try
sure.
to handle it diplomatically. I'll try to be respectful. I mean, not try. I'll always be respectful. And if something creeps me out a little, I mean, I have called the police before on some of the stuff that I've received. So
Mm,
I
mm,
do that kind of thing. The extreme goes a long way. And I just, if I may add this one thing,
sure.
I won't mention names, but I do know, I'm friendly with someone whose loved one was murdered, and it's a pretty famous murder.
Mm,
And she didn't know that she was participating in a podcast that at the end, after she participated, called it a sexy murder.
oof,
And she was traumatized, and she called me and she said, I can't believe somebody did that.
mm.
And I said, I can't believe that either. But there are people to take it to that extreme. And so, I mean, you do you. There's nothing we can do to control other people. It's just I can tell you that's not something I would participate in.
Yeah, no, no, absolutely not. Yeah, that's absolutely awful. Well, I guess those bits of it aside, we can get into some of the stuff that's in the book. So the first thing to discuss here is how do we give me the boundaries or limits here of what it is. So how do we define what a serial killer is and is not? Is that the right term we should still be using? I think it's kind of more of a colloquial thing, but I don't know if there's more of a appropriate term. I don't get too hung up on terms. I mean,
Sure,
they're always changing, but I think there's some ways to be kind of as respectful as you can. So
sure.
how do we usually define it?
So, I mean, I do use the term serial killer in my research because I think that's how people would look to access the research. But you are right. Some people do use the term serial homicide offender, SHO. Um, in academics, what I've seen use the definition would be three or more victims with a cooling off period between murders of at least 1 week. But different entities have different definitions. I've seen two murders, etc. When I read the United States FBI definition online, it occurs to me that maybe somebody who was involved in two uh, DUI or DWI, driving while intoxicated deaths, would be considered a serial killer. And whereas the whole thing is horrible, I don't think that's what we're trying to capture here. So in academia, I still use the term serial killer. Um, three or more victims with a cooling off period between each of at least 1 week.
Mm. So this is really, I guess, the serial part of it, right?
Mhm.
And this is what is making it different than someone that is a crime of passion, or as you mentioned, somebody there was an accident and someone died,
Sure.
involuntary manslaughter, things like that. When we think of this, whether it's two or three or whatever, is there something about, I guess, I mean, I might be jumping ahead here a little bit, but is there something about the folks that are doing this, a murder, cooling off period, another murder, cooling off murder, so on, that there's a certain type of profile or a type or a personality kind of aspect to this? Because obviously a lot of people, you know, aren't, um, doing this kind of stuff,
Right.
or thinking about doing this stuff. And so for some folks, how do we think about this idea of a profile of what we can see, or some patterns or themes for folks that will do serial types of murders?
Sure, absolutely. I think that's a great question. So I will tell you, I have not studied male serial killers, serial homicide offenders, uh, as much as I have female serial killers. So I could tell you more about female serial killers. Um, I will say, comparatively, female serial killers, there tends to be an overrepresentation of mental illness. And in the data that we have, uh, it was something like 90% of the male serial killers we studied had some form of mental illness versus about 40% of female serial killers. So there's a lot of mental illness going on here. When you consider in the population in the United States, the percentage is about 1 out of 5, so 20%. So you figure 40%, a lot higher, 90%, an awful lot higher. So there is mental illness involved. When it comes to women who perpetrate these crimes, um, I would think you'd have to be cold and calculating. Okay, maybe the first one happened, right? But you'd have to plan the second and plan the third to meet the definition of female serial killer. Um, in my book and in my research, so I've conducted research separately, and then I conducted research for the purposes of writing the book. I did find a lot of psychopathy, so a lot of psychopaths. Uh, Somebody able to, well, maybe somebody who doesn't experience emotions in the first place, and they very likely know that this is the wrong thing to do, but they're going to do it anyway. Absolutely disregard for the rights of others, callous, um, glib, that kind of thing. So probably some psychopathy involved, although probably not always. um, what we found in our research was the they tend now my I just let me just say this: the data that we collected were based on serial murders perpetrated by females committed in the United States.
Mhm.
So there might be differences between countries, there might be differences between Western world and Eastern world
Sure.
cultures, right? We know that. But in the United States, they tended to be white.
Mhm.
They tend to be probably in their 30s when they started. When we could ascertain religion, which wasn't very frequently, always it was Christian. Now I've got to say we couldn't get the data for everybody, but it was 100% of the time these women were Christian. Probably married at the time of their time of their first murder, but likely to be married more than once. Um, Probably pretty smart, at least above high school. So high school diploma completed, some college completed, and variety of professions, but up to, I think it was 39% were nurses, aides, hospital administrator, or some other kind of caregiving role. So there is, what we can call maybe a profile of, if we put all the statistics together, right? But I want to mirror something that you said before, and that almost everybody doesn't do this, right?
Sure.
So
Yeah.
you're going to
Sure.
find somebody that checks all the marks in the profile that we laid out, and they're probably not going to become a serial killer. But when we look back, we did a study we found 64 women who committed the crimes in the United States, or what was to be the United States, because we had some in the late 1700s. Yeah, that's really what we found.
Yeah, I was going to say, the way you're describing it, it sounds like, a suburban soccer mom of sorts. I mean, it's just not, it's not, yikes, but I think that's where the idea of like, yes, someone can meet all the criteria, but that doesn't mean that they're going to
So
become a
I'm going to
killer.
just say this audibly. You said that while I took a drink of my water, and I almost did was rude there. Yeah, it does sound like a suburban soccer mom. In fact, this is interesting. I sent the paper. One of my great friends from high school is a nurse. And I sent her my paper, and she called me. She goes, "Oh my God, I think you described me here."
Yeah, yeah.
And then we got to talking, and this was somebody I know a very long time, and clearly not scientific. And I said, "Why do you think a nurse would do this?" And my friend said to me, "Hey, now don't take this the wrong way, but right now I could sit here and tell you 100 ways I can kill you, and no one would ever determine it." Like, oh my goodness. So, they have the people in the hospital profession have the means to do it. They have access to vulnerable patients, et cetera. So nobody knows why, but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think with you talk about it in the book, but with female serial killers, I guess the question here that some people will be curious about is we can get to maybe just general sex differences at some point, but I guess the thing here would be, what would be somebody's motivation, right? Or if you're talking about females, what would be their motivation to want to kill multiple people? And if a large part of them are in the healthcare profession, or they're nurses, or in the helping profession, it seems like there would be a different type of way in which someone would have multiple kills, than maybe some of the more, I don't want to say grotesque, but some of the more common ways that we know with men, or we have known with men. But I guess, what is it that you feel is in the cases you've observed or looked at, and some of the ones you're talking about in the book, is the motivation? Obviously, you're talking about a financial motivation, some money,
Right.
things like that. But what are some incentives for women, killing, multiple times?
All right. So you asked about the motives of female serial killers. And the most common one is financial gain, but the motives really are they're all over the place. I mean, some killers kill to be, try to be a hero, for just for the thrill of it. Some kill to get people, quote unquote, out of the way. Um, there is a variety of motives. What we did find very interestingly is that there are structures and classifications of motives put forth based on male serial murder. They were put together by experts in the field, and really, female serial killers don't fit neatly into those motives. But if we had to, definitely the most common motive would be financial gain, or what they would refer to in the literature as a hedonistic motive, like I'm getting something out of this, right? So for profit. And you ask what the incentive would be, and I mean, just reading the different cases, definitely there was monetary gain, like insurance from dead husbands or whatnot. I also saw some cases though where the female serial killer said, "I don't really know why I did it. I did," like, so one woman killed all of her kids, and she said, "Well, I don't know why I did it. I really did love my family." And she said it was trying to think, Rhonda Bell Martin. Right. So she said, I killed my family. I don't know why I did it. I really did love them. Maybe somebody should study my brain. So, motives go from profit, thrill seeking, sometimes angel of mercy, although not, I didn't see that very frequently, even with the nurses. Um, and even like collateral damage. Let me just get you out of the way so I can continue to commit my crimes.
This is very interesting how those motives seem, well, I mean, I can ask, but it doesn't seem as common with males. And so I wanted to ask you about this. We'll talk about it later, but what just generally, why do we look at, or why has there been more press or more coverage of male serial killers? I mean, people could list off, you know, Gacy, Bundy,
Mhm.
Dahmer, Green River, all these people that, and part of that probably is from, um, uh, you know, fictitious accounts or dramatizations or things like that. But still, why is it just the kind of more shock and awe of things? Is it the number of murders? Is it what is it that gets male serial killers get more, I guess, coverage than females?
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it's the shock of it. I think that's the
Mhm.
more morbid curiosity, right? And if you compare the crimes, like somebody, so almost always a male serial killer, it's a sexual motivation. So you're going to find somebody who's very victimized, mutilated, maybe bodies left behind, just terrible, terrible crimes. We might not know who it is, but we might see their victims and what they've done to, you know,
Mhm.
what typically these women. I know they kill men as well. Sometimes they kill children, but
Mhm.
largely they target women. Versus a female serial killer, evidence suggests that um, we just kind of we have this string of poor unfortunate victims, and then maybe realize this woman has been the common denominator, right? So you have a certain woman tied to a series of dead victims, and maybe the crime isn't perceived as gruesome and shocking compared to that of male serial killers. So, for example, a nurse who kills patients, certainly it's terrible, but giving somebody a heart attack with insulin might not capture our attention as much as,
Mhm.
a
Mhm.
string of disposed victims in and around Washington state or something like that.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I do believe it's more of a curiosity. And then you mentioned something about productions, largely amplifying or showing to the world what male serial killers have done. But the truth is, they wouldn't make those shows and those movies if people weren't going to watch them,
Yeah.
right? So it's cumulative causation. It's a reflection of what people are interested in, and then by virtue of showing these things, people become more interested in them.
Mm.
It's just right. So people don't think somebody killing 8 babies is something interesting you want to see on TV. It's
Mm.
terrible. It's
Mm.
horrible. It's shocking. The number one word I've gotten in my book reviews from people and professionals is disturbing, because I talk about some of the
Mhm.
infanticides and whatnot. And it is,
Mhm.
they're absolutely right.
Mhm.
But I don't know. I don't that it doesn't make for good TV, and I don't say I blame them on that one.
Mm. Yeah, it's very interesting. I wonder. Again, we'll come to maybe some of the differences. Typically men are seen to be more aggressive than women and things like
Right.
that. But again, I think some of the stuff in your book shows that men and women can and do kill
Right.
serially. Obviously, there are differences in how they do it, or the frequency, or the volume, but they absolutely do. So it is interesting. So let's talk about psychopathy, sociopathy, about those terms, and we can mention the PCL-R. So, how do you usually, in the literature and in research, how do we use these terms? People will say, kind of colloquially, like, "Well, this is a psychopath or sociopath," and my understanding is that there's people don't really agree. They're kind of interchangeable, but I do think that some prefer some more than others, and some people will say there's a difference. How do you usually kind of explain this?
So I'm going to go with the preponderance of professional opinions on this,
There we
because
go. Yeah.
yeah, again, right, because I stress I'm not a clinical psychologist, I'm not a counseling psychologist, and
Sure.
like you, I have heard the terms psychopath or psychopathy and sociopath or sociopathy just
Mhm.
used interchangeably, and I guess at the end of the day, reading everything I could about it, probably the best differentiation I heard, and I think it was Hare that said this, was that if you believe the issues this person has is solely a product of society, then you might say sociopath. But
Mm.
if there would be a biopsychosocial component
Mm.
to the way they're feeling and behaving, then it would be psychopathy.
Mm.
So in my book, I went with psychopathy, although when the literature I cited used those terms interchangeably, then I had to do that.
Mm. I would say that sounds right. I mean, my understanding is that psychopathy is the more preferred term. It's the one that I use, but I've heard people, you know, argue about it. So I don't really have uh, uh, any kind of aspect in this race about which is the right term. And maybe there is a more accurate one, I just don't know. But I also use psychopathy. So maybe we can talk about Harris checklist with psychopathy. I think that's important. So the PCL-R, it's the revised edition. I don't know if there's a newer one. I think that's still the current one. I could be wrong on that. Was made by Hare. It's based on a 4-factor model of psychopathy. I think I have this right. I haven't given it in so many years, but and it's 20 items for 4 factors. I think it does map on to the big 5 of personality, and usually the items are scored on a 0, 1, and 2, if I remember correctly. And so the higher it is, the more you score higher on psychopathy. The lower,
Sure.
obviously, the lower. Now, this is given to folks, and obviously, so just as a disclaimer for in terms of kind of psychometrics or psychological assessment, you never make. Well, psychopathy isn't a formal diagnosis. That's one thing, but
Right.
you're not going to formally label, let's say, somebody uh, uh, a psychopath or a sociopath, whichever word you prefer, based on one measurement, right? Obviously,
Right.
there's an interview, there's collateral interviews. You're going to give other tests within the battery, many components of this going. But obviously, if somebody comes in and they're usually this is given in forensic hospitals, and so you're going to give
Sure.
a if you're doing a type of risk assessment, or if someone has the instant offense and then their subsequent offenses, and it behooves somebody to say we should probably look into this, and so they would. Harris PCL-R is one of the go-to, or has been the go-to. But one of the things, my understanding of this was, and again, I'm not close to this kind of research on this, but clinical or otherwise, but is that we have come to, and I believe Hare himself as well, was that psychopathy is a type of continuum, in the sense that it is not so to put it this way, that these are more continuous variables, that these aren't discrete variables. So discrete variables being you either are or you're not, you're in this
Right.
bucket or not in this bucket. But psychopathy is more of a continuum. So people are going to place different places on there.
Sure.
And there are maybe, I don't want to say adaptive ways in which we do it, but there's ways in which we subliminate that, I guess, and we use it advantageously in society. So if you run a big business, you might have some traits or whatever. But in a clinical sense, where people have committed crimes or committed murders, and they're scoring in a certain range, that they're going to fall somewhere in this kind of nucleus, or this kind of
Right.
space on the continuum. So I guess all that kind of front loading on that. How much do you think about psychopathy as a continuum? What do you think about the PCL-R? Again, in an academic sense, I know you're not in the clinical world, but just in an academic sense, as an instrument for trying to understand where folks are. Because when you come across it, I don't know if you're in the literature, you're looking at it, and you're like, well, did this person, where did they score on this? And if that is the case, if they did or they didn't, how do you usually see these instruments or these ways of conceptualizing psychopathology or psychopathy?
Sure, absolutely. And so, just to get the disclaimer out there, as you said, I am not a clinician. The only thing I can add to my own research and to my book was others' reports of PCL-R scores, right? So, I just wanted to make sure, because we psychologists, we have to be very upfront about that. I
Yeah.
have seen the PCL-R used to assess serial killers, including Eileen Wuornos, and just a couple other cases. I agree with you that the evidence strongly suggests it's a continuum, right? So, I do think there is a cutoff score, right? Set forth
I
by,
believe so. I believe
yeah.
so.
And I think it's lower in Europe than it is in the United States, which is interesting,
It is
right?
interesting. Yeah.
So is that the kind of thing where, and again, I don't have the clinical training for this, but I mean, as psychopathy falling on a continuum, if you fall above a certain score, does that mean you're in the realm where you are capable of harm, right? Versus a black and white type of, like this binary psychopath, yes, psychopath, no. I do agree about the continuum piece. And I do mirror what you said about some people using psychopathy not for criminality per se, but it's been studied as a trait in some successful CEOs and whatnot, right? If you don't care what other people feel, it's easier to get to the top. So some people could parlay that, kind of lack of emotion, or I do understand your emotion, I just don't care about it, to claw their way to the top. I hear you. And there are some people who argue that it could be an evolved thing, right? Like an advantageous. So part of psychopathy, as you know, is it's not just the callousness. It's I can act like I have emotions if I need to, right? And Cleckley long ago referred to that as the mask of sanity. So if you're upset and you're crying, then I can pretend I'm crying, right? But then I don't mean it, and I can just turn that off on a dime, right? So maybe that psychopathy, that dangerous indifference accompanied with that, well, I can act it out if I need to, might have evolved as a as a societal strategy. So it is an interesting construct. You are right in that it's not a formal mental health diagnosis. I'm not sure that should be the case, but you and I don't make the rules about the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual or the ICD-11, right? So, but maybe it's time to take a look at that. But it is, part of psychopathy, if I'm not mistaken, is antisocial acts, right? So that could qualify for antisocial personality disorder, which would be diagnosable. I can't imagine I don't know if this is controversial, but anybody, male or female, who's committed serial murder, so at least 3. I don't know how you don't turn off your emotions. I don't know how there's not at least some form of psychopathy involved. And let's say somebody kills one person. To meet that definition, you've got to kill somebody else and then wait and then kill somebody else. That takes cold and calculating and, as little as emotions as possible, I would think. But that's just my take on it. How about you? What were you thinking on that?
Well, I think what becomes there's a lot of crossover here on this stuff. So I think the first thing is about the cutoff. I would imagine the cutoff, I can't remember, it's been a long time, but I remember typically how these measures work is that there's something that reaches what we would say clinical significance. And so at that point, it's more of not a you do or you don't have something. It's more of, okay, at this level, it's been enough of the items that reach, these certain scores, and this total number or raw score, whatever, if you're converting them to T-scores, Z-scores, whatever, reaches clinical significance to say that this would have a clinical impairment of sorts, or this is going to be enough to impact negatively in a more globalized way. That would be my assumption. Again, I haven't looked at it in a long time. It's really tricky. I don't have enough well-developed opinions on this. I do think it's really difficult. So, okay, here's my thoughts on this. I do think, because this comes to like a conceptual thing.
Right.
So you can obviously have various types of mental disorders, what we would classify as mental disorders or mental illness, and not have psychopathy or psychopathic traits. Of course, even for folks that that do have antisocial personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder, etc. In the inverse of that, I'm not thinking of anything specifically. So, and again, this is just my opinion without data. So this isn't an empirical statement I'm making, but I would suspect that you could be, very high on psychopathy, and to use that term, an individual with psychopathy, or that exhibits psychopathy, without mental illness. Now, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I don't have data in front of me. I haven't done that research, but there's a lot of
Yeah, I get it.
aspects of psychopathy where, and it really just could become one of those things about how we conceptualize things. So, for example, let's take personality disorders out of the picture for a minute.
Sure.
Is there a space where someone could be psychopathic in their behavior and even aspects of who they are, and have no clinical disorders? They don't have depression, they don't have anxiety, they don't have psychosis, they don't have an eating disorder, they don't have a sleep disorder, they don't have a neurodevelopmental disorder,
Right.
etc. I don't know. I mean,
I hear you. So here's what I'm going to say to that.
Go ahead.
So what I heard you say was that somebody with psychopathy might not have another disorder. So that would be comorbid, right? But I would argue that psychopathy is a mental disorder. I would argue that it is because of how it must have come about. I mean, surely there might be some people born without the ability to feel emotions. But I could tell you in my readings, and again, I'm a research psychologist. I've been doing this a long time. Not being a clinician aside, I am a data wrangler and I could look at commonalities. Um, so if psychopathy is, maybe it's not comorbid with anything else, but think of what psychopathy is in that you have the argued inability to feel emotions or understand or care about somebody else's emotions. Now, can't we argue that is disordered thinking? That's not thinking like the rest of us. You and I wouldn't do the things that serial killers do, right? Who have psychopathy do. And so to come to that state, right, to come to being a psychopath, I would say, and again, I don't know the history of everybody, right? We know that, but in the case studies that I put together for my book, and I did about 27 of them, including, so clearly mostly females, but some males as well. Something happened to these individuals when they were younger, sexually traumatized, physically abused, otherwise, really,
Sure.
really horrible things.
Yeah.
Now, if something like that is done to a kid, to a child, how can they fight back? They don't. What they do is they dissociate. They turn it off. They turn off the world because it's the only way they can get through these bad things that are happening to them. And so for some people, that turning off of emotions was adaptive, right? And then maybe they just didn't have the ability to turn them back on, or this happened at some kind, like, again, I'm not a clinician, but maybe there was some kind of clinical period, or rather critical period, by which these emotions couldn't be turned back on, and now they just can't do it. And I bring up this case. I know I wrote about female serial killers, but I bring up the case of John Wayne Gacy, who was beaten literally in the head by his father for years, and then he was molested by two different people. And Casey might have, I'm sorry, John Wayne Gacy might have been a psychopath, but people don't usually lie about being molested, and his sister corroborated something had happened. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So beaten mercilessly and molested twice. He had told his friend who wrote a book about him, it was I read about it in my book. I'm sorry, the guy's name escapes me, but he said, when my father used to beat on me, I just turned it all off. I turned off my emotions. How else could I get through it? Couldn't fight back with my dad. So turning all of it off was a response. It was adaptive for him. And then look how that came to affect other people very, very badly down the road, like 33 victims. So by virtue of psychopathy being the end result of something tumultuous, why can't we argue that that's a separate mental disorder? Why can't we argue that's disordered thinking? It's not thinking like the rest of us. And so somebody who's outside of the clinical world, I mean, I'm a psychologist, we're all cut. I'm a research psychologist. We're all cut from the same cloth, but somebody looking, from within, but into the clinical world, I'm not really sure why that's not argued for more thoroughly. So do you have any, I'm curious of your thoughts on that.
Well, I just think that because it's different means it's disorderly. And I know you're not saying that. But look, because yes, someone has disordered thinking, or they have poor affect regulation, or they have terrible interpersonal skills, or they have, all these things that is different from the 68% in the bell curve of the rest of
Right,
us and,
right,
and normals, quote unquote, in society, right?
right,
I don't necessarily think that it's necessarily disorderly. I think it's just different. And again, you're talking about this in the sense of, well, they're doing horrible things, right? Or
right,
potentially doing horrible things,
right.
which isn't good, obviously. But I guess that the question becomes, which do we have here? We have horrible acts or horrible behaviors, but it doesn't necessarily always translate to the person. Now, obviously, there's somebody that's doing it, but it doesn't mean we don't know the motives or intentions of what people are doing. And yes, obviously, there's the comorbidity, right? Could you have one or the other without the other? Sure. Could you be psychopathic and not have a mental disorder, another mental disorder like personality disorder or clinical disorder? Sure. Or could you have a clinical or personality disorder and not have psychopathy? Yes. In terms of comorbidity, I think we agree there. In terms of psychopathy as its own disorder, I'm not sure why it's not placed there. I mean, I probably wouldn't fight it if it was placed there,
Okay.
but
Right.
it's a strange thing, right? Because I don't know what the epidemiological rates are on people that have psychopathy, and if it would be enough to say a potential for people having it or not having it. Maybe it is a certain uh, group that does have it. I totally agree in terms of your ideas about etiology.
Right.
There are potential for people to have serious abuse, neglect, all different types of abuse and various trauma throughout early attachment periods, childhood, adolescence. But there are many people that do have that and don't go and kill people.
Right.
Which I know
Absolutely.
you're not saying that either, and I say that's a just your path is set. But I think it obviously would be in the mix for sure. And then you're right, many people that are serial killers do have those types of backgrounds. But I think one hypothesis that people have made for a lot of different things, for serial killers or people with psychopathy, for pedophiles,
Right.
is that there's a chance that it could be a neurological disorder,
Sure.
which also has some potential value to that argument as well. Unclear, right? It's
Right.
unclear
Absolutely unclear. Yep.
because you have, less, neuronal activity or less white or gray matter, or the fMRI lights up in this space and it doesn't for other people, doesn't necessarily correlate with, aha, that's why.
No,
you know,
there's no being able to tell. Even like the world premier neurocriminologist Adrian Rain, even he said, nope, you can't put somebody in a brain scanner and say,
yeah,
oh yeah,
right,
you're going to be a serial killer.
yeah, yeah.
There's just not, and just as exactly like you said,
Mhm.
there could be structural issues, there could be functional
Sure,
issues,
sure,
there could be
sure.
connectivity issues. We just don't know at this point.
Yeah.
And that's actually one question I always get. What about the biopsychology of serial killers? I mean, I tried to write a chapter on it in my book, and there's really not a lot out there.
Yeah.
Certainly, you could extrapolate and talk about, well, if somebody is a psychopathy, if somebody is a psychopath, or if somebody at the very least has frontal lobe dysregulation where they can't
Mhm.
control their impulses.
Mhm.
Okay, but that doesn't translate necessarily into serial murder. People ask me, what's the biology of the serial murder and that murderer? And that's just not known. And people get mad when I can't answer that. I'm like, well, I can't make it up for you and still be a scientist. It's just there's a couple studies out there that might, that look post-mortem at the brains, like this very
Mhm.
famous serial killer, a male who committed crimes in France. And he was one of the last people to die by guillotine. They examined his brain like fairly recently and found some lesions that could have explained some outbursts. So maybe you have a handful like that, but
Yeah.
it's not cut and dry, Xavier. What I argue in my book, and I try to present multiple perspectives, biopsychosocial, is that, I mean, you can have somebody who has, evolutionary forces and biopsych issues, hormonal and genetics, and you can argue that they have a traumagenic background and some clinical disorder, and be at a time in history where they're oppressed with gender roles. You can have all of these things. But remember, almost everybody who ever lived was not a serial killer, right?
Right.
So we don't know the quote unquote recipe for this.
I also wonder here about just personality.
Right.
And the person that comes to mind, and is kind of the low hanging fruit here, I guess, if you will, of examples. But I think of Ted Bundy, which very unclear. I mean, he claimed all the way to the end, nothing happened to him in childhood. He, as far as I can remember, there was no real abuse. There was no, and I wonder. Look, I mean.
Right.
There's no intelligent designer behind the curtain here, right? Natural selection has flaws. I mean, there's just ways in which this is just, you're going to get something that just turned out wrong. And I just wonder if there's certain, just too many combinations of aspects of personality that are all blending together. And, you have people that have instinctual drives and they have less inhibitions and all of these things. And so is that a disorder? I mean, I don't know. So obviously it's disorderly conduct, obviously, for other people, of course. But in terms of a clinical sense, I don't know. I'm not, maybe I'm just less eager about it than you are about having a disorder.
I hear you. No, you're exactly right.
I wouldn't fight it, though. I wouldn't fight it.
I won't fight it either. I won't fight back. I do wonder if it's time to re-examine, although I don't think it's ever been stopped being examined, the definition of legal sanity versus insanity, because
that's long overdue,
right? John Wayne Gacy, or
long overdue.
For example, Eileen Wuornos. I mean, she had schizophrenia. The woman.
Yes.
I mean,
and a lot of abuse. A lot of abuse.
Oh my gosh! Yeah, absolutely. And that's the one. Somebody asked me what's the one thing that surprised me after emerging from writing my book. It's that I felt sorry for some of the serial killers. I did. And it's surely, believe me, exclamation point, I feel exponentially worse for the victims and their families and their friends. Of course I do. But then take somebody like Eileen Wuornos. Does anybody read her background? She was raped, and she had who people alleged were his grandfather's baby. Her father was a convicted child molester who died by suicide. Her mother abandoned him. She had an incestuous relationship with her brother. She got set on fire when she was younger. Her grandparents refused, or her grandmother, I should say. Eileen's grades were going down in school, and they called the high school and said, "Can we get her counseling?" And they said no. And then they threw her out when she was pregnant. So, if I told you that story and didn't say it was Eileen Wuornos, people would have mercy and pity on this individual. I wish she had gotten the help she needed, clearly. Maybe 7 men would still be alive.
Yeah, of course. And I think that there's also this idea of, it is conceptually, I think it's different when, I don't know, there's a type of, there's a philosophical or conceptual difference here of, if somebody is, as you're pointing out with Eileen's story, traumatized in a variety of ways, or for long term, some what people say is complex trauma, of course, and she has obviously a chronic mental illness with psychosis of sorts, with schizophrenia. That almost just she's just an untreated mentally ill patient,
right?
And she's ill, she's sick, and that to me just, again, from my experience, my clinical experience working with folks that have psychosis and schizophrenia for a long time, I just have a lot of empathy for folks like that. I don't have, again, of course, anybody that has, that's families of the victims, of course, but I have empathy as well there, and it's horrible. But a lot of that is a failed lot of things, right? Relationships and a system and not getting treatment. But that's different than just, well, we don't know why this person just started killing all these people. Could it have been neurological? Was it personality? Was it something in their history. They don't carry a mental illness. That I just think that's like conceptually a different way of looking at it, right? Because like
I
one is
agree.
more coming from a clinical perspective, and the other one is, well, we don't know, and as far as we know, there's no psychosis or things like that, and so that's much different, I think, in terms of what are we looking at. I guess the other thing here is I'll make two statements here about this. So the first thing is about psychosis. So
Right.
there is a small elevation of violent crimes for folks that have um, some psychosis and mental illness, especially folks that are chronically homeless and they have other issues going on. It is still nowhere near. I don't have numbers in front of me. Nowhere near. Anything of above 10 or 15% or things like that. So the likelihood is that people that are mentally ill, yes, are they going to be more likely to be potentially violent than just quote unquote people that don't have mental illness? Yes, but it's not that significant.
Yeah, I don't have the numbers on that either, but I do know the data show that somebody with mental illness is far more likely to be victimized themselves
That
than
as
they
well.
are than
That
they
as
are
well.
to be a
That as well.
perpetrator.
Yes.
People who are mentally ill are very prone to exploitation and
Yes.
violence
Yes.
and
Yes.
uh,
Yes.
and it's terrible. And so again, I emerged, something else I emerged from my book with is that wow, we really, really need more mental health resources in this country, especially early intervention.
Yeah.
Especially early intervention. If something terrible happens to a child, especially a child who's been through trauma. In fact, there's some research out there that shows in later life a psychopath can't be helped if they get treated. It gets worse.
Mm,
Some data have shown, their
mm.
condition gets it's worse. But maybe a child early on, if we get, and some evidence suggests like a multi systems intervention, like school and home and friends and whatnot. Something bad happens to a child, help them early on. And so, right, so I emerged with this knowledge that we really, this exclamation point, we really need more mental health resources. But I'll tell you what, I also emerged with knowing that we need more police resources.
Mhm,
So,
mhm.
right, so maybe if the detectives had more resources at their disposal, maybe the person wouldn't rise to the, meeting the criteria for the third murder and not be a serial killer.
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
I imagine that we'll have fewer serial killers because of our sophisticated detection techniques these days. But still, I know and the world is not like the television show
No,
CSI. My friends at the
no,
New
no.
York State Police Department assure me that
Mhm.
it doesn't work like that. You don't get your results back, free and quickly. It's thousands and thousands and
Yeah.
thousands of dollars for testing that police just don't have. Just take a look at any state's, rape kit backlog. We just don't
Mhm.
have those resources.
Yeah.
And as a citizen, I don't understand that.
Yeah.
Right.
No, no, no,
So,
no, no.
right.
I'm with you on that.
Absolutely. Yep.
I would say the mental health piece. I know this gets talked about a lot and stuff, especially with the homelessness problem. I have a friend of mine. We've talked about it, Chris Ferguson, and and both he and I, um, I obviously in the clinical world, he does a lot of the research stuff, and we both agree that there should be some modern form of institutionalization. Of course, now this is I guess in some circles a controversial suggestion. Most people are still traumatized, loosely. I'm usually loosely using that word with what institutionalization was like in the 40s and 50s and 60s and
Sure.
70s and that whole process of deinstitutionalization. But there are my view on this is it doesn't matter after a certain point. So I think what you're saying, proactive early intervention can be helpful. But for people that are adults that have had decades of chronic mental illness and they are currently living in tents on the streets in many major cities,
We've let them down.
there's no possible way without very serious treatment 24/7 that they can be sustainable. I don't think. I've worked with inpatient and outpatient for a long time. I don't see that. I don't
You're,
see
you
that happening. And
I
and
agree with
and
you.
we need institutionalization, but for very chronic folks. And that's a hard thing to really get people to get excited about and money behind. I think there's ways you could probably do it, but I think that that's important for people that are in their 40s and they've had schizophrenia since they were 19.
I absolutely agree with you.
Have to do that.
I agree with you. And working with clinical students, I mean, that's, even though I'm not a clinician, that's what I do. One of my students did a study on trans institutionalization, right? So what happens when you get out of a mental health inpatient? There's a likelihood you go into jail, right? Right. So trans institutionalization, and you know that there's a problem when each state would have 15 beds only available in a psychiatric unit. And I hear you, and it doesn't have to be institution like we hear from the 1940s, cold and sterile and abusive and neglectful, right? But why not get people the help that they need? And just what you were saying reminds me of, so much research shows that someone who is mentally ill, let's say somebody with schizophrenia, it's not a one size fits all approach to treating them. You need, different tests and approaches to see what works for that person. So of course, being in one place in a safe environment where there's access to food and healthcare and safety would help that person. And like you as a citizen and someone, loosely in the mental health field, I don't know why we can't do that. We have money in the United States for so many other things. Why don't we have money for mental health? And why don't we have money to feed our freaking school children, give school kids lunch? That's another thing I don't understand. Might not be related to my book, but that's just something
No.
I am keenly aware of, that kids don't have anything to eat in school. We need to do a little bit better.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we saw that in the pandemic where, they were still running lunch programs because that's the only meal kids would have during the day, which is absolutely, depressing. But I agree about the institutionalization piece and about the treatment. And I think you could be on the right path towards solving a lot of things. And a modernized version, it's basically the Dorothea Dix model for 2023 instead of 1858. It's just creating a kind of world within a city, or city within a city of everything's sustainable and stuff. And but what are you going to do? So you talk about this study you did, which you can go as in the details as you want, in the weeds as you want. You go full runway on this. Had 64 female serial killers. You had already talked about some of the demographics earlier, but just tell us how you did the study, what the selection process was, and tell us your research methods and and the selection and testing and results and all the fun stuff and studies.
Yeah, absolutely. So my student Erin Murphy and I, we wanted to do a study on female serial killers, and we got a couple other of my colleagues involved. Tom Bowers, who's a forensic clinical psychologist, Claire Flaherty, who is a neurologist and a clinical psychologist, and then one of my clinical students at the time, her name is Lavina Ho. So what we did was we used what's called the mass media method. So I didn't interview anybody, right? I'm not a clinician. I'm not allowed to do that. And I wouldn't do it anyway. I don't have the skills. But what we did was I keep saying that and I know it, but we have to. What we did was we found, original newspaper reports, court documents, whatever we could find access that spilled out facts for us. And I have to say it's interesting because stuff we pulled out of the newspaper of the time. Remember, we're not talking about fake news. We're not talking about journalistic interpretation. Reporters just, for the most part, report the facts that they find. So, and what we derive from, if it helps, what we derive from those reports really did come out exactly like what clinicians and their other clinicians in their research had said. But anyway, we read newspapers, court documents, sometimes historical societies. I didn't do books and whatnot. Books are secondary sources. We went to, newspapers, et cetera. And what we found were 64 women who committed their crimes in the United States. We didn't do team killers because I wanted to make sure. So there's more female serial killers who committed their crimes in teams, but you can't really parse out who did what or who wanted to do what, who planned what, and who has what mental illness, right? So we just did solo perpetrators, and we didn't include people who had wartime or religious ideology, like people who killed for Charles Manson and stuff like that. So solo female serial killers who committed the crimes in the United States, and we were able to identify 64. And what we did was we gathered as much information as possible on their crimes, their motives, their victims, and nobody had done anything like this before. So that's why I thought it was important, like I said, even though I'm not in the clinical field, to collect mental illness data and whatnot. And what we did was we published a study in the Journal of Forensic Psychiatry and Psychology, and we wrote out, I mean, we called it a profile. I understand profile could be data presentation, but we called it that. And we wrote out what might exemplify, based on statistics, a quote unquote typical female serial killer. And we said she's likely white. She's probably been married. She's probably had multiple marriages, probably in her 20s or 30s, maybe middle class, probably Christian, at least average intelligence. She's probably average or above average attractiveness, probably going to have a job, very good chance she's a healthcare worker. Background, besides mental illness, there might be some abuse issues that we did find, that not all the time, but probably more common than typical. Personalities could vary, right? She could be arrogant, she could be withdrawn, she could be flippant. There could be a triggering crisis event, but we didn't find that commonly. But what we found was also about victims. People who are around her, so physically around her, particularly people who are related to her, are at risk, especially people who are vulnerable. So the elderly, people who are sick, and people who are children. And then just to wrap it up, major motives for money or power. Most common means poisoning, but also used some asphyxiation in there, like smothering by pillow. And that might be to mimic natural death or avoid detection. And then we found that these women, so women did commit these crimes in suburban, urban, and rural areas, and sometimes it went across those different regions, but the most common then would be suburban areas. So I'm not saying, suburban only, but across those areas. So we put together those statistics we put together that profile based on the frequencies and the means and such that we found. Go ahead, sorry.
What was this time frame again? From when to when did you look at the newspapers and the mass media and things like that? What was the years?
Let me just grab those numbers for you so that I make sure I answer you correctly. So I'm just going to go to my methods here. 1821 to 2008.
In the United States, yeah.
In the United States, yeah. We went with the United States because I'm in the United States, and we had, I'm part of Penn State University. We have superior library. I have access to newspapers and different periodicals around. But if it's not in English, I'm not able to read it. So I just kept it United States. So rightly so, there may be generalizability issues. I'm gonna be bold and say that if you conducted this study in different Western nations, you'd find just about the same thing. That's my bold prediction. But I don't know Western versus Eastern culture, or Western versus tribal societies and whatnot. I wouldn't be able to make a prediction on that.
Okay. And so after finding all of these things and having this profile, what was some of the conclusions that you were able to come to? Some of the results, I guess, but what were some of the conclusions that you were able to really hang your hat on and say, okay, this is what we found, and this is what we can say, and this is what we can't say, maybe?
Sure, absolutely. So, I mean, really, what I just read to you, we were there to present data, right? Just I'm a data wrangler. I wanted to show here these are the commonalities. But as far as being an evolutionary psychologist, noting that these women, the top motive was for profit, it got my evolutionary wheels thinking. And at that time, reviewing other people's research, I'm like, okay, well, what's the number one motive for male serial killers? And it was sexual gratification. I'm like, aha, men kill for sex, women kill for money. And then later on, what we did was I took the data we had for the female serial killers, so the same women, and then we collected data on male serial killers in an age-matched and era matched studies. So if this, I'm just going to make this up, right? So if this female serial killer was 35 and committed her crimes in the 1950s, we found a male who was around that age committed his crime. And we did this matched sample study where we compare male and female differences. And then again, yeah, of course, our study yielded that men typically kill for sex, women typically kill for money. And you could trace that evolution to evolutionary tendencies. Let me just say, though, of course, exclamation point. I'm not saying people evolved to be serial killers. If we did, we wouldn't be here, right? They probably all be gone by now. But in terms of, evolved strategies males versus females have based on fundamental reproductive differences between the sexes, right? So you think, this goes way back to like Trevor's theory on different parental investment and whatnot, right? So men produce millions of sperm on a daily basis. Women, you're born with all the eggs you'll ever have. So men, of course, across time, culture, studies, teams, right? Men prefer more sex, more frequent sex than do women. There's a premium on sexuality there. Again, I'm not saying women aren't sexual, because women are sexual, but men are according to data far more sexual. So men killing for sex didn't surprise me. And then if you think about that another way, right? Men produce millions of sperm on a daily basis. Women born with all the eggs you'll ever have. You have to be really, really careful of your reproductive opportunities. And so of course you'd gravitate toward resources. So women killing for resources just didn't necessarily surprise me as a research psychologist based in, with training in evolutionary psych. So that's what I came from, evolution, that's what I derived from this. But also what we derived, generally speaking, was I don't think anybody, to the extent that my team did before, emphasized, oh my goodness, wow, there's a lot of mental illness here that hasn't been talked about in the forensic literature before. In fact, not too many people have done, a large scale study of female serial killers. There's a lot of case studies. I mean, Eric Hickey and his team surely did. Kelleher, Amanda Farrell et al. They did some research, but the studies are few and far between. So to find that level of mental illness, about almost 40% had some form of diagnosable mental illness. And again, I was surrounded by clinicians on this paper, so we were able to say that. That was very surprising. And to me, it set the stage for, wow, okay, if there's mental illness involved, and clearly it went untreated, right? Or clearly, it wasn't, even if it was treated, it wasn't treated to the extent needed. Maybe we could do a little bit better in the world in terms of helping people. So those were some take-home themes from that study.
Yeah, no, it's very, very important and very powerful to do that kind of work in that study. I guess you talk about the motivations for females for monetary gain or otherwise. But just what about this idea you're talking about? In the book, some stories about some of them would kill children, their own children, and some infanticide. And I guess what that obviously can't be for money entirely.
Right, absolutely. So what's the motivation?
What do we make of that?
Right.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Now that may be it. Well, first of all, if you are killing for money and you're getting your kids, this is going to sound awful, right? But getting your kids out of the way, you are keeping more resources for yourself. But that's certainly that resource gathering mechanism gone awry, right? Because you're supposed to gather resources unconsciously to provide surely for yourself, but also for your offspring, right? So that your offspring grow up and they reproduce and they pass on genes to the next generation. So something's going terribly wrong. But in terms of killing kids, you're absolutely right. And so, people do ask me that. Well, Marissa, you're arguing there might be an evolutionary motive, but certainly killing your kids is the antithesis of reproductive strategy, right? And so just like
it depends on the animal.
We
see this in other animals or other animal kingdom infanticide. Sure.
We absolutely do. So if a squirrel comes in and kills the unrelated squirrel babies, then there's more resources for his squirrel babies. But why would you kill your own? And what I thought about was think about the caregiving mechanism. So an evolved caregiving mechanism as this distribution of inherited degrees of this. And
Mhm.
we were talking about the bell curve before, right? With that 68% in the middle.
Mhm.
And so think of mothers, right? So right in the middle of the bell curve would be the quote unquote normal mother, the right amount of love and caring and investment, allowing autonomy for the kid to learn, like good parents, their kids are going to live to see another day, good parents. And think about, like, maybe on one end of the tail, you have those parents that are over involved and overindulgent, and they get anxiety disorders just worrying about every single thing that their kid does, like too highly involved. All right.
Yeah.
But then think about the other end of the tail on the bell curve distribution, where you get people who harm their kids and abuse their kids. And then think down, way deep down in that other tail, are people who kill their kids.
Yeah.
So it's just a malfunction of the caregiving mechanism. You're right. You said before, things don't always go neatly as planned, right? There's probably not some intelligent designer behind the scenes saying, and you get connectivity and you get connectivity, right?
Mhm.
Something could go wrong along those lines. And surely something had to have gone wrong in women who kill their kids.
Yeah, it's one of those. It seems like it's one of those mysteries of sorts.
Right.
Of we don't have all the answers for things, which is frustrating. But it is peculiar, the inner workings of the human mind and things we still don't quite understand. I
Yeah.
really think about in this in on this bit of things.
Right.
A lot of the works by Dostoevsky. I mean, if anybody's read Crime and Punishment, it's a great book. But there's it's amazing because it's this, like, the psychological profile of somebody, which is amazing, which is about why did he kill two people, right? And he didn't know why. It just came to him.
Right. Well, you're exactly right. Now, some of the female serial killers in the book say, "I don't know why I did it."
Yeah.
But if you do go to infanticide, I mean, there was at least one woman who said, "Well, I killed the kids to get it out of the way." They really did. And for infanticide in particular, you can go to some anthropological theories, like by Sarah Hardy and others, that uh, infanticide is in the animal kingdom is theorized to happen as a result of one hypothesis is overcrowding. And you take the case of somebody, like in the book I mentioned the case of Lydia Sherman, where I think she had there was 8 kids in the family at one point. That's not hard to imagine, that there was overcrowding in a middle class household. Now, that's terrible, right? We know that. I'm not going to call babies overcrowding, but think about
Right.
this.
Right.
She's already not thinking the way we do. And just unconsciously, maybe there's this primal drive to eliminate some of the mouths to feed, just like what happens in the animal kingdom. And it's disturbing and it's disgusting and it's unkind, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Yeah, it exists, and that's the thing about it is that's the thing that makes everyone uncomfortable. It's the fact that it exists, right? Because it's like, why does it exist? And we don't have a whole spelled out, theory of why and why wouldn't. I mean, there may be one that we stumble upon at some point, but it's hard to really know concretely, you know, to take the life of another person is already difficult to imagine.
Right.
But to take the life of a child is another layer. And then to take your own child is another layer. And of course people would say, well, of course
Exactly.
this person's mentally ill. Yeah. uh, Sure, you could say it that way. Is it diagnostic in the system that we have? Maybe, maybe not. But there is something different about how this
Yeah,
person's mind is working, for sure.
you're absolutely right. And so, I mean, but don't put me on a jury, because right away I'm going to say that person's mentally ill. They don't think like we do, right?
Right,
Right.
right,
They
right.
don't. She doesn't think like we do. In the case of Lydia Sherman, she poisoned 3 of her husbands, at least,
Yeah.
that we know of, and killed. She probably killed about 11 people, according to the estimates, and some of them were little babies. And
Mm.
and you mentioned before, why are people interested in that? People typically read that and recoil,
Mm.
but for some reason, if it's an adult and it's more, is visualizable a word, like I can see the damage that this person inflicted on this other human being, I can comprehend it a little bit more. I'm not really sure how that works either. And then you had I mean, everything you're saying is great. Another great point before, like, well, what makes this person go this way? but as a psychologist, we don't know what makes somebody's mind normal. So how are we going to know what makes it abnormal? It's like when we talk about, right? When we talk about, I teach human sexuality. When we talk about sexual orientation in class, we don't know what makes somebody, what makes them heterosexual, let alone why somebody would be non-heterosexual. We just don't know exactly how that works yet. Now, when we solve these mysteries, I'm not sure, but but providing more mental health resources and research is something we can do, and providing police and detectives with more, with more funding and more availability of experts and tests and whatnot, we can do this. So why don't we work on what we can do before we, work on that other stuff?
I agree with you on all of that. I guess that my point of this is, and I'm removing myself from a personal thing of this is so terrible. I mean, there's the obvious point of this, that these things are terrible. But look, I put it this way. Let me change it up for a minute. If we'll do the bell curve thing, so 68% of us, etc., and let's say on the other end of the tail, we got the very intelligent, the super empathic, humble, like all the good stuff we like, right? And they're much different than folks in the middle, but it's all the good stuff we like. It's fairly adaptive in society. There's no problems with it. We wouldn't want to treat them per se.
Right.
Maybe some people would. We would want to say, well, this is different. You're in, you're 2 standard or 3 standard deviations above the mean. That's but the question here is not necessarily the frequency or the volume. You could only be less than 1% of the population. The question here is more, and it's not that there's difference. That's not the point here either. To me, it becomes, what do we as a society, and that will evolve and change over time, agree upon as adaptive?
Right.
What is not going to cause harm or infringe on someone's well-being? But philosophically and ethically, I don't think that's a universal. Meaning, is the universal? Does everyone have the same definition of well-being?
No, they don't.
So that's one problem with that. And even if you take that is a universal, which I think you probably could based on the humanity of somebody, you still have to say, well, society has to say or agree, this is not okay. We're not okay with these behaviors. And sure, give treatment for that. But to me, that's just difference in the way that we don't agree upon as a society is productive, I guess you could say. My point here on this is, at the end of the day, they're still human beings. They're still individuals that have thoughts and feelings and intuitions and motives, and many of them could be very grotesque and vile, and they may have done other things. But if it becomes this thing of, if you have a universal of humanity, you still have to care, well, if you're consistent, about all humans, not just the ones you like, and especially the ones that may be different. And I think that not everyone has to do that, but there has to be enough people that are doing that.
Well, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. And it's Rogerian thinking, right? Like, well, you're a person, and we have to have some kind of care. And then we go back to what we were talking about in the beginning, which is these things are not okay, but we sure are interested in programs and paraphernalia and books and videos and documentaries and podcasts about this kind of thing. And it shows you we're interested. Are we interested in stopping it? Hopefully, right? So, but you're absolutely right. And then what I wanted to say something, speaking to what you were talking about, in terms of, maybe on one end we have a psychopath that doesn't feel, but the other end of the spectrum, when somebody feels too deeply, isn't that also a disorder? Can't that be like anxiety, or right?
Much as the whole disorder kind of language, I would say it's definitely a potential for it to be not adaptive for other people in
Right.
society, and that's problematic. I mean, for a variety of ways. I mean, if you want to use a Freudian term, I mean, their super ego is like on a max of like 11 or whatever, and
Yeah.
that's not always helpful, right? That's not always helpful. So yes, I mean, there is an in certain on certain ends of this where, but the problem with this becomes like, because somebody is different, or because they are different from the norm, it's not that there's this, how do we merge or morph people to just be more quote unquote normative. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. But it's more of, how do we, if there's a majority of people that do things in a more analogous way, and then we bump into folks that are on, 2 or 3 standard deviations above the mean in
Right.
either direction, how do we interact with folks that are different? Not that we change that they're different, but that how do we interact with how they're different? And I think the one thing there is behavior, right? If the behavior is maladaptive to society that we've all agreed on, you go and you kill people, we've all agreed that that's not okay to do.
You're exactly right. I mean, what
So
about
then
somebody
we
who's
say, okay,
right?
we don't do that.
What about
But
somebody who's athletic, 2 or 3 standard deviations? We celebrate them. Somebody
right,
who's artistic, you get Picasso, 2 or 3 standard
right,
deviations. You
right.
celebrate this. But if you take that to the extreme and you're going to kill 3 people or more, we've got to prevent this. We've got to understand
Right.
it so we can prevent it. And if we can help you, if we can recognize that something is different about somebody in a bad way early on, maybe we can help with that. Because I agree with you. These people, the people who committed these crimes, the crimes are heinous, and there's just no way to
Of course.
explain them away.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But like you said, they're people. Eileen Moronis was a person. She was a
Yeah.
person, and she needed help, and she didn't get it, and we let her down. Society let her down. So
Yeah.
they even let derelicts around her when she was in prison. Like, somebody was a horse trainer, went in there and pretended he said he was going to be her lawyer, and those around her let that happen. We let her down. So then what? So the rhetorical question: what do we do, or is it rhetorical?
Yeah, well, and again, obviously, what you've said and what I agree with is, early prevention and treatment, I think, is part of it. I think for people that have really chronic issues, I think ideally some form of, a modern, healthy, humane institutionalization. And I think that there's this, um, there's this question we keep having as a society in a variety of ways, that for folks that are different, how do we mm, celebrate difference, but not entirely. I mean, we don't want to obviously bully or ostracize people.
Right.
It's how do we? This is kind of a cliche, but how do we coexist with people that are different than us and in dramatic or fundamental ways, either or? So okay, you, in the negative space, right? We don't want people killing people. Okay, we
Right.
manage that. We treat that. Okay, but then how do we still have them as humans and individuals that can do other things, right? And then the reverse: how do you have people that are very much, um, uh, as you said, athletes or things like that? Well, we don't just see them as an athlete. We see them also as people that have other thoughts and feelings, things like that. Um,
But
and,
do we? But do we?
oh,
Right?
we don't, but
But do
that's what I'm saying. We
we
should, we
don't,
should,
right?
we should. I agree. Yes, we
Right? The
should.
movie star, like the movie star's movie
Yeah,
star, the athletes, the
right.
athletes. It just this so nothing to do with my book, but like what? But Mia Farrow's mother lived near where I live, and
Uh-huh.
when she passed away, there were people hiding around tombstones trying to take Mia Farrow's picture, and I'm yelling at the TV, "Leave her the hell alone! Like, that's a
Yeah,
person. Her mother died. No, she's fair game. No, she's not. Her mother died."
yeah,
Like, it was just
yeah.
really bizarre. She's a human being, right? So, circling back, right? What do we do with people who are detrimental to society? And I hear you. And just to stress, like, when we say institutionalized, not a cold, careless, something like, Philippe Pinel wanted to prevent, nothing like that.
Yeah.
A home where you can live and be cared for and treated as a
Mhm.
person with dignity and get the help you need. And
Well,
absolutely on board with that.
yeah. I mean, the point of institutionalization in a humane way, in a modern 21st century way, would be for, um, the primary thing is saying that, look, there is some difference here, whatever it may be, neurological, personality, mental illness, etc. the biggest thing is that overwhelmingly, unfortunately, for whatever reason, you pose a giant risk potentially, risk in a lot of different ways of that definition to society.
Right.
Okay, so we're gonna manage this. We're gonna treat this. We're gonna try as best work towards rehabilitation if that's possible. But you can still have that. I talked with Simon Baron Cohen not that long ago, and we
Interesting.
we,
Yep.
we talked about autism because that's his thing. He's done
Sure.
that research for a long time, and he really he does not, again, he said this many times, like the idea of autism as a disorder.
Right.
He talks about it in terms of difference and disability. He said there are aspects of autism that can be disabling for sure, but there's a lot of aspects of autism that is different, and we need people that are pattern seekers and synthesizing all these ways in which he describes it. And I think that's true for a lot of things for people that are different, right? And he is describing
Absolutely.
how do we coexist with people that can have some challenges with some things, but then there's some positive aspects that have difference. And so, I'm obviously not making any comparisons here, but my point is that there's an idea of, for people that are different, positive or negative, how we agree in society, how do we, treat and rehabilitate and do risk management? But how do we also have folks flourish as well, as human beings? If we agree that all humans, that the thing that unites all people is our humanity. Obviously, there's so many individual differences, and that's good and bad, right? There's some
Yeah.
positive aspects
Right.
and negative aspects,
Sure.
but if the human is there, then basic human rights, if you will, well, that goes obviously for people that are victims of horrible crimes and their families. But at a certain point, for certain people and certain providers, that you also have to look at, quote unquote, the people that are have committed those crimes as well. Both are human,
Oh,
and how
absolutely.
do we treat both as human? Of course, we adjudicate people for their crimes, but we also want to, and if various punishments are there, that of course, but we also want to have treatment too. And when we think about the long term thing, when all that's over and done with, the courtroom's done, the sentencing's done, all that. Okay, but how do we also treat people?
I agree with
And
you.
that's really important, and yeah, that's a very hard conversation to have, right?
I agree with you. I mean, I'll tell you another take home point. I emerged from my book appalled by the death penalty, and
Oh yeah,
people might
yeah,
not want to hear that
yeah.
either. But just
I'll lay my cards out here. I've been opposed to death penalty for a very long time. So
I hear you, and just along the lines of everything you just said, this is a person, and they did really really horrible things. And again, of
sure,
course, I'm on the side of the victims and their family.
of
But
course, yeah.
I read this, the case studies, uh, just watching someone writhe and die through a window is not my idea of justice.
Yeah.
It's not. What about restorative justice? Like, what can we do
Mhm.
to, this is still a person. What can we do to, but they've got to, justice has to happen for the victims and their families. So what form might that take without taking a life in return?
Mhm.
And I don't know the answer to that, only that I just don't like some of the things I read about. For example, one female serial killer, the electric chair didn't work quite the way it should, and it caught her legs on fire. And it's
Jesus.
just
Mm.
right. Yeah, that's, does that sound right in anybody's mind? I mean, I guess to each their own. It's just not something I would support.
Yeah. No, yeah, I'm definitely with you. So I mean, obviously we've talked about all of these different components of, obviously the humanity and on all aspects and difference and disorder and all this stuff. And so it's interesting hearing you talk about some of the takeaways from, you get into to write a
Right.
book, and then you learn all this stuff writing it and all this, oh my goodness, and things you didn't recognize or
Right.
realize, which is
Things
cool.
about things about yourself too.
I'm sure. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
really, 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 really interesting. I wanted to just ask a few more questions here
Sure.
about, you mentioned this earlier on about some of the neuroscience behind serial killers. And so,
Right.
we kind of mentioned it, and so I just pitched this question again about this idea of it potentially serial killing and stuff like that, being a possible neurological disorder. You can tell me any of your thoughts on that, and then also the importance of the PFC and OFC amygdala, and how there's certain parts of the brain that are, we consider, I guess, a little bit more significant, or have shown to have something going on with some of this stuff. So maybe just chat about some of the things you highlight in that chapter in the book.
Oh, sure, absolutely. So, I mean, people expect me to talk about the biopsychology of serial murder. I can tell you that there's just not a lot of great evidence out there.
Yeah.
Surely, the few studies that are out there are case studies. Almost all of them are on male serial killers. I think I found in the literature, and again, I do not examine female serial killers myself. I picked out empirical studies, good ones from the literature. I found one that examined a female serial killer who committed
Oh.
crimes in Mexico. And basically what they found was that her brain doesn't respond to emotional events the way other people's brains do. And that's, not surprising, right? So that's like
Yeah.
a neurological substrate of psychopathy. Just you're not responding to emotionality. With some of the male serial killers out there, definitely maybe some lesions in brain matter, or maybe some frontal lobe injuries, or dysfunction, but nothing, no body of compelling evidence. The only thing I could say is that if we tie serial murder to psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder, this in turn has been tied to mixed evidence about frontal lobe dysfunction, or executive dysfunction, or dysexecutive function, whatever people want to call it in the literature. So when you have proper executive function, right, you can make moral judgments. You can decide, hey, I'm not going to throw a plate at my mother. That's not a good idea. I'm not going to punch a hole in the wall. Or I can keep track of time and keep on task. Or I can go over here and do this thing and come back and remember what I was involved in the first place. That's executive function. And it helps you get along in our society, right? And so what that is what they say, generally speaking, is your frontal regions are tied to your limbic regions, your emotional regions. And when your limbic regions send up emotional impulses, your frontal lobes can say, hey, your frontal regions can say, hey, control that, or keep that in check, or really, here's how I should respond in this emotional situation. So for you to have proper executive function, you have to have your frontal regions working correctly, your limbic regions working correctly, and them to be connected together correctly, right? So to have this process in place. And so somebody who commits serial murder, I don't know, are they, can we argue they are, and I wrote about this in the book, serial murder, then can't we say it's planned if you're going to do this crime and then this one and then this one? And so that's not impulsivity. So maybe it's just not relevant at all. But I've heard people tie violent crime and criminals, and maybe male serial killers more thoroughly, to this dysexecutive function. It could be the case. I can tell you, I spent a long time in the literature. That is what I do. I'm a data wrangler. I'm a researcher, right? I research things that have been published. I have not found that much in the literature about the neuroscience of serial murder. Maybe I missed some stuff. Okay, then the next book can talk about it. It's just not out there. And I can't, when people, when I go on speaking engagements, people really want to hear about this. And I'm like, look, I can't make it up. There's just not a lot of stuff. I even had somebody yell back at me once, yes, it is. I'm like, okay, well then you do that in your presentation, and I'm going to come to it and listen, because it's not there. I'm being real with you. And then some of the more recent murderers whom we might have access to their brains with more sophisticated equipment, it just hasn't happened. Like the story goes that the family of Jeffrey Dahmer didn't want his brain examined, and they won in a court case. Or John Wayne Gacy, his sisters said, okay, you could study his brain. The psychiatrist literally took his brain home in a jar in her passenger seat of her car. His brain rode shotgun in a car. If we get to examine, what the hell kind of conclusion that? We can't. The science is there, but we don't have that evidence yet. We don't have the evidence. And the presentation, my guess would be so heterogeneous. In other words, yours is different from yours, is different from yours. I don't think we're going to be extrapolate commonalities. So it's just not there yet.
Yeah. That's. I mean, I'm not in this research, but the little bit I've read on it, that's kind of the takeaway I've got on it as well. So it'll be interesting though. There's room to grow. I mean,
Yes.
brain research is obviously, every 6 months it's changing. So there's lots of things you can always,
Well,
for
you're
future
you're
students can look up.
you're absolutely right. And just let me add, I've been teaching biopsych for 15 years. I
Mhm.
don't use a textbook anymore. Not that they're not good books,
Yeah.
but there's it's been and I don't want to get sued by textbook people, but like I just it's in 2023 the most recently published textbook I would have might have findings from what 2020 or 2021,
Oh yeah.
and
Oh
the
yeah.
field is just so changing all the time that I just put together my own materials.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, let's add that we respect textbook writers enormously. It's just I
Yeah.
find greater utility in assembling the materials for my students myself.
There are some things that are kind of pretty standard. I mean, you got to do, Ramon y Cajal, and you got to do, all of these, kind of the historical stuff, and basic neuroanatomy isn't that different. We know what the cerebellum does, things like that. But in terms of even functionality of things, we're learning new things and changing and stuff. So um,
It's absolutely true.
I want to ask about one of the last questions here is about you have a chapter or so, I think, on comparing male and female serial killers, which
Yeah.
we've talked a little bit about male serial killers here in the conversation, but what did you say were the biggest, I guess, similarities and differences, and how does that map on to what we understand generally about sex differences between men and women from an evolutionary perspective?
Sure. So being honest, I'm pulling up my paper so I could get it right. I'm going to pull up my cheat sheet here. And then the
Okay.
study we did, Harrison et al. 2019, published in Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences. We did find stark contrast between the crimes of male and female serial killers. And let me give the take home first, and then I'll get into the
Sure,
individuals.
sure.
It's just that right there at one point, even authorities said there are no female serial killers, and they
Mm,
attributed all serial murders to sexual motives, and we know that's not true. And if we know that there are sex differences and we find a crime that exhibits particular characteristics, Lordy, at least we could go down the right path, right? So we could say, okay, well, this was probably a woman who did these things, or probably a man. So male serial killers, almost always target at least one stranger, versus
mm,
almost all female serial killers tend to target at least one person they know. So male serial killers kill strangers, female serial killers kill those around them, those familiar to them. Female serial killers were a lot more likely to be related to at least one victim. Um, Female serial killers were more than twice as likely to have murdered their spouse or their partner. Um, so, for motives in terms of female serial killers, most commonly financial gain; for men, most commonly sexual. Men were far more likely to stalk their victim before killing them. Um, in terms of education levels, we saw some differences. Most male serial killers had high school or less. Women most of the time were just at least high school educated, if not some college. Uh, Women serial killers were more likely to be in a relationship, so married or with somebody at the time of their crimes, than were males. It's interesting. Male serial killers were statistically more likely to have a mental health issue, but it's still a lot, right? So about 90% of male serial killers, and in this one study, we found 43% of female serial killers. And then the most common method of killing for men, for male serial killers, it was asphyxiation, and for women, it was poisoning. And then one other thing I want to bring up, and I wonder what you think about this, is that we did found, and I wasn't the first person to say this, Eric Hickey had said this a long time ago, but the nickname that people give to serial killers for women far more frequently says the gender, like Tiger Woman or whatnot, versus you don't hear like Mr. BTK or that guy who's the hillside strangler. You don't hear the gender in the nickname of male serial killers, but you hear it in like giggling granny. You hear it in the
mhm.
nicknames of female serial killers. So I just pulled up my paper and rattled off some of the differences we found. But again, this tells you who should we be looking for if we find
Mhm.
these crimes with these characteristics.
Yeah, on the last point, and the nicknames, I would imagine there's definitely probably a gendered aspect to that for sure. I would say also probably just the infrequency of it. Most people
Yeah.
don't assume that, women would kill that way. And so there's probably that would be my assumption is sort of
Right. Well,
the
you know what?
gender
You'd
piece.
be, statistically speaking, you'd be right, because about the estimates are, and these aren't my estimates, these are from the FBI and whatnot, that only about 1 out of 6 were female serial killers, like, 5 out of 6 males. So if you guessed, hey, males, yeah, you'd probably be right, right? The odds are in your favor. But so you're absolutely right. So maybe there's the need to ascribe the gender, or maybe it's a bias that people are just not
Yeah.
thinking women are capable of these crimes, which is, again, a point of me writing the book. Women are just as deadly, maybe differentially deadly via poison, to
Right.
people they know, but the crimes are no less heinous, in my
Mhm.
opinion.
Yeah. Well, you detail a lot of that in the beginning chapters of some of these accounts. It's pretty awful and grotesque.
Sure.
The the last question I have here is that you've written about female serial killers, you've done research on it, and there it's important to understand. But where do we see, I guess, this research going, and how can we continue to have good research done on female serial killers or women that commit multiple murders? How do we where do you see? I mean, obviously, I'm sure there's research you're doing on this, or maybe where other people could do it. But where would you want to see research being done in the future to have a fuller understanding of these types of profiles?
Sure, absolutely. So in my research, when we were investigating mental health, we really ticked yes or no. I
Mm.
haven't analyzed what that entailed. I mean, I haven't listed like depression or anxiety or factitious disorder imposed on another, also known as Munchausen's by proxy, but just maybe an analysis of, what led to what I would like to see happen. Um, I would like to see this information being used to inform police and detective work. If you pull up the United States Federal Bureau of Investigation website, the information about serial murder largely speaks, well, I should say only speaks to crimes that are mostly characteristic of male serial killers. I'd like to see some updates for law enforcement to have as a reference. And then let's be realistic in that this is so rare. I mean, is it, do we really need to invest resources in this type of thing? I mean, look, I'm one of the people that does this, and I'm not sure that's the case. Like, I don't know if there'd be like a $3 million grant to study this kind of thing, female serial killers. It's just not that common. But take it up, a step and say, okay, well, what came from this research? Mental health, more police resources, right? God hold a big to fund the police. I don't know what that means. All I know is that my research shows that
Yeah.
police need more money to do what they do well, and detectives. And I'm going to add, my grandfather was a police detective. So not that it's a conflict of interest. I just know they need more money for what they do.
Mhm.
Um, and then maybe what I'd like to see coming from my particular research is, this deeper ongoing conversation on what constitutes sanity or not legal sanity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so that you killing somebody is wrong. Okay, but somebody who does that, they don't think, I'm circling back. They don't think like you and I do. If they kill 8 babies, they don't think like we do. Something
Mhm.
needs to be done to understand and to help so that this doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with all your points there. I think that that's what's important, and you can see the kind of the practical implications that can come out of doing really good research on this. Well, the book is called Just as Deadly: The Psychology of Female Serial Killers. It's out everywhere. Where can people find the book, and where can people find you and your research and online and all those good places?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you to Cambridge University Press for taking the chance on me with this. I hope people find the book. I don't want to say like it because it's disturbing, but I hope people find it engaging and informative and useful. You can find it on Cambridge University Press website. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it on the websites of Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, just anywhere they sell books. It's usually
Mhm.
available. You can find me online. I work at Penn State Harrisburg. You could look me up, Marissa Harrison. You can email me at work if you have any questions. I'm glad to engage. I'll let me know what you thought about the book, what you think might happen for future directions. I'm willing to listen, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about the book today.
No, I know. I listen. I mean, I'm really grateful you came on, and the pleasure's all mine. The book is great, and you're fantastic, and I really enjoyed the conversation immensely. So
Me too.
big thanks. Big thanks.
Thank you to you too. Really, really great talking to you. And I'm gonna have to learn more about the PCL-R so I can engage in that a little bit more thoroughly. Absolutely. But yeah, very, very interesting stuff. Thank you for being so gracious and so well informed. And I really appreciate this opportunity.
Of course. Thank you.